things, and that'll be an extra clip for you guys also, so when you're looking at it later. All right, your topic is pretty straightforward, and I think that you identify your significance claims in the first affirmative pretty clearly. There's not a single piece of evidence that says any of these things is a real problem. This is all asserted on your part, that parents will be stressed, that that it's particularly costly, that it's a slower learning system that is going to create an inability of the kids to function. Those are all claims that you make, and there's not any evidence to support this. So without any evidence to support it, you could make up, I could get up and say, homeschooling causes 100,000 children a year to become mentally retarded and causes 50,000 people to die on our nation's highways every year, and it turns people into atheists, which is bad for our morality. So we should get rid of homeschooling. I can make whatever claim I want, and then there's that's the justification for getting rid of homeschooling. That's not a legitimate argument. You have to have some grounds to support your argument. We don't have any grounds that are presented here. We have a theory, we have an idea that this might happen. At best, they're hypothetical examples. That's the closest that you get to having any evidence here. What if a parent doesn't have, gets up in a bad mood one day, it doesn't feel like teaching math? Or what if a parent has to work that day and then they're going to be stressed out because maybe they won't have enough money? The only evidence that we got in the first affirmative is a potential cost issue. It could cost you maybe from $300 to $3,200 to teach your kid at home. All right. That, and by the way, I didn't get a source citation on that either, but I do know, I'm willing to concede that that's probably a reasonable estimate of cost. How much different is that from what a parent would spend to send their kid to school? I mean, is that above? Because I tell you what, my kids went to public school and money went out of my pocket every frickin' day, sending my kids to public school. I had to pay for them to have lunches at school. I had to drive them someplace. I had to pay a fee for them to be able to participate in a field trip. My kid is in the band. Holy criminy, there's a band fee. Plus, we were expected to volunteer and create time that we volunteered to do things, that it was fundraising that was going on there. My wife is an elementary school teacher, and I spend more money on other people's kids than I spent on my own kids in public school. Every time I go to Costco and Sam's Club, I have to buy damn pencils because apparently public schools do not provide pencils anymore. So the idea that there is no cost to public school students and there's only a cost to homeschool students, you have to have an explanation of that. And based on just my own experience on this, that's one of those things that I'm not sure that that's a good justification. By the way, what you guys ought to be saying about this is, if a homeschool parent wants to accept those costs, that's their decision. They should have a right to make that decision. The argument that the affirmative makes is that most of these people choose to do this primarily for religious and ethical grounds. Right? They make the decision based on some moral standard. That was like 72%, and it's actually gone up that 83% of the homeschoolers are now doing this. All right? What's wrong with that? Is there any reason that they shouldn't be able to do that? Is there any ethical or value issue that suggests that that's inappropriate? And if they choose to do that, that's their decision. And say they think it's more important that their kid grow up in a particular moral environment and learn particular things, and if they have to spend $3,200 to do it, that's worth it to them, as opposed to, I saved $3,200, but at least my kid is in a cesspool over here learning a bunch of crap that I don't believe in. You ought to be challenging their grounds on these kinds of arguments, and I didn't really hear any argument about that issue. There needs to be a stronger defense of the homeschooling thing from the negative side, just like there needs to be a stronger argument that says that there's something wrong with it. The best argument that the affirmative has in the debate is the argument that says that there are 100,000 kids who are going to go unschooled out of this 1.5 million who are being homeschooled. That these kids are not being handled effectively, that they are not learning anything, that they're kept home and they become functional idiots or something like that. I think that's a really good argument. And you need some better evidence on it, and you need to show that homeschooling is what allows this to happen. That's why this problem exists. So, parents just are too tired to take their kids to school, and they're too stupid to teach their kids anything. So they end up keeping them home, letting them watch TV, having them do chores with them around the house, and they don't teach them anything, and then the kid grows up without any education. That's a good point to make, and that's a good reason why we ought to have, get rid of homeschooling, because that allows that sort of thing to happen. But you need to develop that argument a lot, because to me that's the strongest argument that you have. The other arguments that you have, that they might not learn anything, they have the only evidence, and I think, Will, this was a mistake in your rebuttal, to start with the one thing that they are clearly ahead of you on this, and that is they're the only ones who present any statistics on the effectiveness of homeschooling. And what is that effectiveness? We know that they graduate from college at a rate that is, 10 to 15% higher than kids who went to public schools. We know that they score on objective tests like college admissions tests or standardized tests, that they score in the 88th percentile as opposed to public schools that score in the 55 percentile. So if we're talking about which one teaches the kids the best, the only statistics presented in the debate are the statistics provided by the negative on this, which shows that their effectiveness. And your criticism of the statistic at the end is a little bit late in the process. And the only criticism that you have is, well, it's a smaller group. Well, yeah, it's a smaller group. We're only talking about 1.5 million people. But of those 1.5 million people who are going to homeschools that you're worried about, 88% of them score in the top percentiles on SAT tests, and 2/3 of them will complete college, as opposed to whatever the numbers are, the 100 million school children who aren't homeschooled. Only 55% of them are going to complete college that actually go to college. I think those statistics are the good argument that the negative has on this particular position. And so you guys need to get a lot more out of that and point out that the affirmative has all these hypotheticals that are going on this. Now, the idea of socialization, all right, this is a good theory. This is, the kids are not going to get exposed to others and so on and so forth. You start off by kind of apologizing, almost acknowledging, well, it is true that they could be socialized because they do have clubs and organizations. They do have to do these other kinds of things. But, the fact that they're not in school for 6 hours a day with other kids isn't the same as, being on a club or a team. Okay, I think if I was the negative, I'd be saying, well, yeah, it's not the same. It's better. But you don't say that. You say it's not the same. How is it not the same? What's bad about that? The kids need to learn to manage conflict, for instance. When they play on a team, they're playing a game. It's a very organized kind of situation. That's not the same thing. If they're in the Boy Scouts or they're in some other group, that's not the same thing. They have to be able to manage the kind of stuff that goes on in the schoolyard. Bullies that are picking on them, saying no to drugs, handling conflicts with others, interpersonal issues that are going on a daily basis. If they hide out at home, they're not going to be able to do that. And again, all of this is hypothetical at this point. Where's some evidence that suggests this is a problem? Blake's got some evidence from the psychologist that he quotes that says, we don't see any problem. There's not any data that suggests that they're any different, that they develop skills that are any different. I think that's a good argument on that. So you need better evidence on that particular point. They've got some response on that issue. And so that's a little bit problematic. I think that the second negative also needs to, you have a disadvantage that you present at the very end of your rebuttal that should have been in the constructive speech. And that's this argument that says, what happens to this 1.5 million people who are now currently being homeschooled when we abolish homeschooling the way the affirmative wants to do? where do they end up? Hey, they have to go into the public schools. You want to talk about reducing the effectiveness of the schools. Let's take schools that are currently not very effective and add 1.5 million students to that school system. Is that really going to make those schools more effective? I think, to me, it seems strange that you are not making a vicious attack on the public schools. You're letting them get away with all this stuff about how great the schools. Oh, the teachers, they're credentialed and they understand ADD and they'll be able to do all this kind of stuff. Have you seen a public school? I think that's what you guys should be standing up and saying there's a reason that people want folks to go to private schools or to homeschool. That's because the public schools suck. And you ought to be pointing out that, in comparison, everything that they say, let's compare it to the public schools. So are kids better socialized in public schools than they are in homeschooling? What measures could you use for that? What measures could you use to determine how well kids are socialized in public schools or at homeschool? Crime rate, number of violent incidents, fights that break out, drug use, juvenile activities by, juvenile criminal activities by kids who go to public schools versus kids who go to, who are homeschooled. Expulsion, suspension, all those other kinds of things. I tell you what, when some kid at homeschool, he's not going to get expelled from his school. That kind of thing. Which, by the way, might be one of those problems that you point out. And I think you've got that, like I said, you've got that good argument there that says that there are 100,000 kids who go unschooled. Let's find out about the ADD thing a little bit. I think that's an interesting argument that you also have here, that teachers ought to be able to handle those kinds of things. Those are problems that everybody in the public schools has to learn to handle, and people who are homeschooling, they may not even be aware that a kid has a problem. That's a very good point. And so that ought to be a point of exploitation for the affirmative side in the debate, pointing out, look, there are a lot of things that you can't get in homeschooling that you can only get in public schools, because only public schools have the resources, the training to do this. They say at one point, and you're getting to it right at the end, Will, where you say they have to have they say you have to have a credential to teach at homeschool. Well, here's the inherency issue again, where nobody in this debate has really talked about what the guidelines are. What happens in homeschools? If I suddenly wake up one day and say, I'm tired of sending my kids to school, it's a pain in the ass, I'm going to homeschool them every day, can I do that? Or do I have to have a credential? I didn't hear any law referred to. I didn't hear any statute cited. No expert indicates this to me. I know people who've homeschooled their kids. They don't have a credential. They lived in California. They homeschooled 5 kids, and they didn't have a teaching credential to do that. All right. But do the kids have to pass a standardized test? Well, I heard a reference to that at one point. So how does that work? Are the kids tested on a yearly basis? Do they have to pass those tests? If they have to do that, then I think the negative's got a good argument here that says it's unlikely that those 100,000 kids are going to be unschooled for long because they have to pass that test. On the other hand, if there isn't a test like that, and we don't have any way of checking on the progress of homeschooled kids, which is what the affirmative is saying, then this problem is really a bigger issue. So you guys have to kind of, once again, the inherency issue I think is being neglected a little bit. Will, just as a comment, in the second affirmative, it sounds to me like you're kind of giving us a summary of what's supposed to happen in the second affirmative, or what an affirmative case is supposed to have, because you keep making references to all the stuff that I had in the explanation of what is a significance claim, what is an inherency claim. I want to hear the arguments there. So, what are the needs that are not being provided for by homeschool students? They need to learn a diversity of topics, and parents are not capable of providing that. Schools are. That's your need argument. What's the advantage? The advantage is that you get socialized in the process also, or that you have exposure to a lot of things that a homeschool student wouldn't be able to be exposed to. The disadvantage, that the negative ought to be talked about is, well, you mentioned it a little bit, what if you are a student in a public school, you are locked into a curriculum often that's directed at making sure that people pass a test as opposed to learning something. Whereas in homeschool, we know if a kid understands something. We go through this on a one-on-one basis. That, like you said, it's not 1 to 29, it's 1 to 1, or maybe it's 1 to 5. When they come up and say, oh, maybe there's a parent who's stressed because they're trying to teach 5 kids at home and they got a lot of other things. What the hell do you think a teacher is? Sitting there with 20 or 30 kids that they have to deal with on a daily basis. Oh, well, maybe a parent needs a break. I'll tell you what, every teacher I know could use a break. They could use a break from the 30 kids that they're getting every day, and they don't get necessarily that break. So why is it such a great thing to have the kids in the public schools and not to have them homeschooled? You guys need to make these contrasts, and you need to have better evidence. The evidence thing to me seems really thin. I heard maybe 5 or 6 pieces of evidence in the debate that were cited, and I heard assertions about a lot of information, and it just feels like it's kind of underdeveloped. You've got some good ideas. They start to be organized, but they need to be organized a little bit differently. All right, I'll stop pontificating and let you